Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. He slammed the bedroom door so hard the walls trembled, and I stood frozen by the window, still clutching the broken plate he'd thrown at my feet just minutes before. My fingers bleeding from the shards, but my heart too numb to care. The clock read 2:17 a.m., and I knew I wouldn't sleep, just like every other night for the past 4 decades, trapped in a house that whispered cruelty through every wall. 40 years of marriage had silenced me more than any locked room ever could, and at 60 years old, I had become a ghost in my own life, enduring his bitterness disguised as concern, his insults masked as advice, his control wrapped in the suffocating illusion of love. I used to dream in colors, now I only saw gray. And as I stared into the night sky, one question echoed louder than all the silence. How had I survived this long pretending not to be dying? At every party, every church gathering, every neighborhood barbecue, people looked at us with admiration. The perfect couple, they said. So devoted after all these years. I smiled politely, nodded in agreement, played my role with such precision that even I almost believed it sometimes. But behind those polished smiles and practice jokes, Richard's eyes would flash with silent threats if I spoke too long or laughed too loud. At home, he didn't hold my hand, he didn't ask about my day. He talked at me, not to me, and only when he wanted something. He treated me like a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. Always in the way, never quite right. Love had become a performance, and I was the aging actress forced to deliver her lines without ever being heard. The only time he really looked at me was when he wanted to remind me just how small I'd become. "You're worthless," he said, barely glancing up from his newspaper when I forgot to buy his brand of coffee. "You can't even get that right," he muttered when the laundry took too long to dry. These weren't isolated moments. They were daily cuts, paper-thin but endless, slicing into me until I stopped noticing the sting. He didn't scream or throw things. Not then, but his words always found their target, carving doubt into my bones. I started apologizing for things I hadn't done, flinching at the sound of his footsteps, shrinking into myself more and more each day. He turned his disappointment into a routine, and I wore it like a second skin. After a while, I didn't even need him to insult me. I had learned to do it myself. Once I was going to be a journalist, I had a scholarship, a dream, a spark that lit up every time I held a pen. But when Richard proposed, he said we'd build something beautiful together. And I believed him. "There's time for all that later," he told me. "Right now we need to focus on the home, the future, us." I gave up the scholarship, thinking love was worth the trade. I gave up nights out with friends, hobbies that made me laugh, causes I cared about. Piece by piece, I handed my life over, trusting that the sacrifice would come back to me in joy. But the joy never came. And by the time I realized what I had lost, I couldn't even remember the sound of my own voice when it was free. He said he was taking care of me when he stopped me from working after our first year of marriage, but it felt more like being locked behind glass. "You don't need to worry about money," he said. "I'll handle everything." At first it sounded like love, protection, stability, devotion. But soon it became a rule, then a chain, then a law I wasn't allowed to question. I wasn't allowed to have my own bank account, or even know the passwords to our bills. He controlled every dollar, every decision, every detail of our lives, and I was expected to smile in gratitude. I lived in a beautiful house I didn't own, wearing clothes he approved, cooking meals he chose, and pretending it was enough. One afternoon, after a rare walk alone, I used the change in my pocket to buy a small coffee at a corner cafe. Nothing fancy, just warmth in a paper cup. When I got home, the receipt had fallen out of my bag, and he found it before I even took off my shoes. "A useless spender," he spat, shaking the paper like it was evidence of a crime. "Do you think money grows on trees?" he barked, ignoring the fact that I hadn't bought anything for myself in months. He stood over me, listing every bill he paid, every sacrifice he made. as if my existence was some enormous debt he regretted taking on. I stood there holding a cold cup of coffee like it was proof of my failure. I didn't cry. I just nodded, cleaned the kitchen, and poured the coffee down the drain. He handed me grocery money like he was doing charity work, counting the bills out slowly, dramatically, while listing exactly what I was allowed to buy. "Don't get clever," he warned. "No extras, no junk, and I want the change back." I brought him every receipt, every coin, placing them on the counter like offerings to a king, hoping each time he wouldn't accuse me of hiding something. He always found a way to criticize: too expensive, too cheap, not the right brand, too much sugar, it never mattered. I was constantly one mistake away from an explosion I couldn't predict. The money wasn't support, it was surveillance, a leash, a way to make sure I never stepped out of line. He didn't need bars on the windows, he made the world outside impossible to reach. At first, it was small, subtle remarks about how my friends were a bad influence, how my sister didn't really understand me. Then came the missed phone calls, the messages I never saw, the visits that were always inconvenient, because he had something important planned. One by one, the people in my life slipped away, not because they stopped caring, but because he made sure I couldn't reach them. I started telling myself they were busy, that maybe I was too. But the silence grew heavier with each passing year. Holidays passed without a single Merry Christmas. Birthdays without a call. I was surrounded by walls, but lonelier than I'd ever been in my life. And worst of all, I had no idea how to find my way back to them. It happened on a rainy Tuesday, not during a fight, not with any warning. I dropped a glass while washing dishes, and the shatter echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. He came in quietly, looked at the floor, then at me, and without a word, shoved me hard against the counter. I hit my hip and fell to the ground, more shocked than hurt, staring up at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "It's your fault," he said coldly, stepping over me like I wasn't there. He didn't help me up. He didn't say sorry. That night, I told myself it would never happen again, but part of me already knew that something sacred had broken between us forever. I didn't call the police. I didn't even tell anyone. I cleaned the broken glass, rubbed ointment on the bruise, and whispered to myself that it was just a moment, a mistake, not the man I married. I clung to the idea that love was meant to endure, that patience could heal anything. I convinced myself that if I stayed calm, if I tried harder, if I changed just a little more, he'd soften again, return to the man who once held my hand under the stars. But the truth was, that man didn't exist anymore, maybe he never did. And every time I swallowed the pain, every time I pretended nothing had happened, I gave up another piece of myself. The bruises faded, but the silence stayed. It was dinner soup again because we were cutting costs, though his liquor cabinet said otherwise. I placed the bowl in front of him, and he touched it with the tip of his spoon, then looked up at me like I'd insulted his entire family. "Cold," he growled, and with one swift motion, he threw the bowl across the room. It shattered against the wall, splattering broth down the curtains, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at the mess sliding slowly to the floor. "You're useless," he said for the 100th time, but this time something in me didn't flinch. I cleaned it up in silence, but inside a decision had already been made. I was done apologizing for surviving. That night, after scrubbing soup off the walls and hiding the shattered pieces of porcelain in the trash, I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself under the harsh, flickering light. My eyes looked hollow, my cheeks sagged in quiet defeat, and the woman staring back at me seemed like a stranger I had once known. Tired, drained, almost translucent. I touched the mirror, half hoping to feel something warm, something alive, but all I felt was the cold glass pressing back. There was no fire left in my gaze, no light behind my expression, just a dull echo of someone who used to believe in joy. I hadn't cut my hair in years, hadn't worn lipstick since the wedding of a niece I no longer spoke to. I stood there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just wondering when I had disappeared. Later that night, while he snored with his mouth open and the stench of whiskey thick in the room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling something shift inside me. Not a scream or a panic, but a steady, terrifying clarity. I knew I had no money, no place to go, no one left to call. But staying had become more dangerous than leaving. For the first time, I didn't fantasize about escaping. I began to plan it. Not big plans, not wild dreams, just one simple goal. Get out. I whispered it like a prayer into the dark. I have to go. Not for revenge. Not for drama. Just to survive. The next morning, when he handed me the grocery money with the usual condescension, I took the bills with a trembling hand and nodded like always. But this time, I kept 2 coins. I felt the weight of them in my pocket the entire trip, my heart racing at the thought of disobedience so small yet so dangerous. When I got home, I gave him the receipts, smiled weakly, and waited for the storm that never came. He didn't notice. That tiny victory lit something in me I hadn't felt in years. Not freedom, not yet, but resistance. And so, every trip to the store became a mission. Every hidden coin, a secret act of rebellion. I was building my escape 1 cent at a time. I began hiding money in places he would never look, between the pages of dusty cookbooks, inside tea tins pushed to the back of the pantry, under the lining of old handbags. I learned to sew false pockets in my clothes, tape coins to the underside of drawers, and slide folded bills between mattress seams. Each stash was tiny, laughable on its own, but together they became hope, a fragile, trembling lifeline. Every hiding place felt like a message to myself. You are not finished yet. I counted the money at night when he was asleep, my hands shaking, my breath shallow, always ready to shove it under the bed if he stirred. This was no longer just about leaving. It was about proving I still had the courage to choose myself. One afternoon, while cleaning the bathroom, I noticed an old box of tampons in the cabinet, untouched for years, long forgotten, invisible to a man like Richard. I opened it and realized instantly it was perfect. No man would ever go through it, no reason for him to notice it existed. I took my last $25, a 10, a 5, and 10 wrinkled singles, and folded them tightly into a tiny plastic wrapper, placing them gently beneath the cotton inside the box. My hands were sweating, my stomach twisting with anxiety, but something in me smiled. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a symbol of what he could never touch, never see, never control. In that tampon box, I hid not just money. I hid a future. Every movement I made from that day on was coated in fear, like I was living underwater and trying not to make a ripple. If he found the money, he would know I was planning something, and his rage would not stop at words or plates. I avoided sudden noises, kept my hiding places secret even from myself sometimes, just to make sure I didn't slip. I had nightmares of him discovering a single coin and dragging me by the hair through the hallway, screaming accusations I couldn't defend. I flinched every time he opened a drawer too loudly, every time he paused near the cabinet. I wasn't free yet, I was just quiet in a different way. But fear was no longer the master. It was just a shadow I learned to walk beside. I didn't rush. I couldn't. I needed to wait for the perfect moment, one when his guard was down, when the night was long, and when the risk of being caught was just low enough for me to take the leap. Weeks passed, and every day I woke up thinking, maybe tonight. But there was always something. A visitor, a neighbor, a change in his mood that made it unsafe. I waited in silence, slowly gathering enough money to afford at least a bus ride, a sandwich, a plan B. Each delay made me feel weaker, but I reminded myself, this wasn't hesitation, it was preparation. A bird doesn't just fly. It watches the wind first. It was a Sunday night when I finally felt it, the shift in the air, the silence in the house that told me this was it. I had just enough cash, my documents were already hidden in my coat pocket, and a small bag sat under the bed with a change of clothes and a granola bar. My hands were ice, my body trembling with anticipation and terror. He was passed out drunk, mouth open, snoring with the force of someone who thought nothing in the world could ever leave him. I stood by the bedroom door for almost 15 minutes, convincing myself that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bravery I felt. It was necessity, the kind that burns quiet and deep and unstoppable. Right before I left the room, he stirred slightly, cracked one eye open, and looked at me standing there fully dressed. "Where the hell are you going?" he slurred, and before I could respond, he chuckled. "Even if you left, nobody would ever want you." I didn't reply. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at him, memorizing that face. Bloated, bitter, blind to everything he had destroyed. That was the last gift he gave me, confirmation. In 7 words, he erased any lingering doubt I had left. I turned around, walked out, and didn't look back. I crept through the hallway like a stranger in my own house, barefoot and breathless, the floor cold beneath me and the silence louder than any goodbye. Every creak of the wood felt like a gunshot, every shadow a threat, but I didn't stop. I opened the front door as slowly as my shaking hands allowed, the hinges groaning like they, too, knew this moment had been waiting for years. I looked back once, not at him but at the space where I had disappeared. Then I closed the door behind me, sealing the past in with it. There were no tears, no final words, no dramatic exit. Just me alone in the night, finally choosing myself. I stepped out into the cold air, barefoot and trembling, the weight of my entire life pressing down on my shoulders as I closed the door without a sound. Every step across that porch felt like breaking a spell, the one that had kept me frozen in fear, obedient in silence, invisible in my own skin. I didn't run. I couldn't. I walked slowly, deliberately, like each movement was a declaration. I'm still here. The gravel bit into my feet, and the wind tore through my coat, but I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I could never go back. That was the first truth I carried with me into the dark. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my toes numb, the weight of the small bag digging into my shoulder with every step. I didn't have a destination, just the desperate need to put miles between myself and the man who had slowly erased me. The streets were empty, lit only by dim yellow lamps and the occasional flicker of a distant car. I passed closed shops, silent houses, dark windows that looked safer than anywhere I'd ever lived. The cold cut deep, but it was clean, honest, nothing like the quiet poison I had endured for so long. I was terrified, exposed, exhausted, but alive. And for the first time in years, I was free without permission. I found a park bench beneath a crooked oak tree, the wood hard and damp beneath me, and curled up with my coat wrapped tightly around my body. I clutched my bag like it held the world. My documents, my savings, my identity, fragile and precious. I tried to stay awake, afraid someone would steal from me or worse, but fatigue dragged me under like a tide. I kept one eye on the sky, watching the stars blink behind clouds, wondering how they had kept shining all this time without me noticing. That night, the loneliness was brutal, sharp, unrelenting. But so was the quiet relief of no footsteps coming down the hall, no voice yelling my name in anger. I slept in fear but also in peace. At sunrise, I opened my bag and took out the crumpled $25 I had risked everything to save. It wasn't much, but it was mine, earned in silence, hidden in courage, carried with hope. I used a few dollars to buy a small loaf of bread and a bottle of water from a corner store, and the rest on a one-way bus ticket out of town. The clerk didn't look at me twice, and I was grateful for that anonymity. I ate slowly at the bus station, chewing each bite like it was a celebration. It wasn't just hunger I was feeding. It was pride, the fragile, aching pride of someone who had said enough and meant it. When the bus pulled into Chicago, the city felt like another planet, loud, vast, unfamiliar, filled with people who didn't know my name or my history. I stepped off with no plan, no connections, no idea where to begin, but my heart beat faster with the possibility that maybe, here, I could start over. The streets buzzed with life, honking cars, rushing footsteps, voices speaking every language. I felt invisible in the best way. No eyes following me, no threats hanging over me. I walked aimlessly for hours, looking for something that felt safe, watching the world move forward while I tried to remember how to do the same. I didn't know who I was here, but that meant I could become anything. I passed a tiny motel with a flickering neon sign and a handwritten note taped to the window. Housekeeper needed, inquire inside. My heart pounded as I stepped through the door, bracing for rejection, but the woman at the desk barely blinked. "Can you clean rooms?" she asked, and I nodded before she even finished. She paid cash under the table, a few dollars a day and a hot meal if I worked late. I said yes to everything. I scrubbed toilets, changed sheets, picked up trash left behind by strangers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something: work, purpose, a roof, a bowl of warm soup. For a few hours a day, I wasn't a ghost. I was useful again. The days blurred together in the haze of bleach and sweat, my hands raw from scrubbing, my feet swollen from hours of standing. I slept in a storage room behind the motel's laundry unit, on an old cot with springs that creaked every time I turned over. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice. If freedom was supposed to hurt this much. I missed the illusion of comfort, the routine, even the familiarity of cruelty. Trauma is strange like that. It makes you doubt your own pain, question your own strength. I cried quietly into a pillow that smelled like detergent and dust. But I never wished to go back. Not once. One morning, the motel manager handed me an envelope that had arrived with no return address. Inside, a short note from a former neighbor. She wrote that Richard had told everyone I had lost my mind, that I'd run off in some kind of breakdown, abandoning him without warning. "He says you were unstable," she wrote, "but I don't believe it." My hands shook as I read it, the familiar guilt rising like acid in my throat. Even hundreds of miles away, he still tried to own the story of who I was. I almost ripped the letter in half, but then I folded it and put it in my pocket. Not as a wound, but as a reminder. Truth doesn't need an audience. Just needs to be lived. That night I sat on the motel steps, watching cars pass and thinking about how easy it would be to go back, to apologize, say I was confused, and fall back into the quiet numbness of routine. At least I knew how to survive there. Here I was barely holding on. But then I remembered his voice, the way he had said, "No one would ever want you," like it was a fact written in stone. I remembered the bruise on my hip, the way he had stepped over me, the soup dripping down the wall. And just like that, the temptation disappeared. I'd rather sleep on a floor and eat breadcrumbs than ever let him own another part of me again. With the first money I saved from cleaning rooms, I found a listing for a tiny room in a shared house, just big enough for a mattress and a chip nightstand, but it had a lock on the door and a window that opened. I paid the woman in cash, and she didn't ask questions. I cleaned it top to bottom, scrubbing away the dust, lighting a small candle I found at a thrift store, and folding my clothes into neat piles on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That night I lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling again. But this time I felt something new. Not comfort, not joy, just the quiet relief of being somewhere I had chosen. That first night in my own room, I lay on the mattress, eyes wide open, listening to every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the cracked window. But for once, there were no footsteps coming down the hall, no sudden slamming doors, no voice calling me worthless. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was clean, still mine. I took the deepest breath I'd taken in years, held it, and let it go slowly, like I was exhaling everything he had ever told me I couldn't be. It wasn't peace yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of space to exist. I slept curled up, clutching a blanket against my chest, and for the first time in decades, my dreams didn't end in fear. Each morning I walked through a small park nearby just to feel the sun on my face and the sound of leaves beneath my feet. I started picking up old books from a thrift store shelf, romance, history, poetry, anything to remind my mind it still had a voice. I didn't rush. I didn't force joy. But one afternoon, I caught myself smiling at a dog chasing its tail, and it shocked me. That simple, involuntary smile felt like lightning, proof that something inside me still worked. I wasn't healed. I was waking up. And even laughter, once forbidden, had begun to return to me. One morning, while walking past a little cafe with chalkboard menus and flower pots in the windows, I saw a sign that read "Help Wanted, Reliable Staff." I stepped in, heart pounding, and asked if the position was still open. The owner, a tall woman with kind eyes, looked me up and down and asked, "Can you show up on time and work hard?" I nodded without hesitation. She smiled. "Then you're hired." The job paid better than the motel and came with a regular schedule, tips, and hot coffee I didn't have to sneak. I wore a borrowed shirt and cleaned tables like they were gold, grateful for every dish I carried. And slowly, the cafe began to feel like a place where I belonged. Margaret, the cafe owner, was brisk and no-nonsense, but she noticed things, like how I kept my eyes low, or how I flinched whenever someone raised their voice, even in laughter. She didn't pry, didn't push, but she started setting aside a cup of tea for me before my shift and asking how my night had been. I lied at first out of habit, saying I was fine, just tired, just adjusting. But she kept showing up, steady and quiet, and one night after closing, I sat across from her with trembling hands and told her. Not everything, but enough. She didn't look shocked or sorry. She just listened, nodded, and said softly, "You're safe now." That sentence cracked something open in me I didn't know was still holding on. It was after hours, the chairs flipped on tables, the lights low, the smell of coffee lingering in the air when I told Margaret about the soup bowl, the first bruise, the tampon box, the night I left barefoot. I spoke like I was reading from a script written on the inside of my ribs, every word shaky but unstoppable. I hadn't said these things out loud before, not to anyone. I kept waiting for her to interrupt, to ask why I didn't leave sooner, but she didn't. She sat across from me in silence, tears gathering in her eyes, not pitying, just bearing witness. When I finished, I felt raw and empty, like I had poured out everything. And she simply reached across the table, touched my hand, and said, "You survived. You're not weak," Margaret said the next morning while I wiped the counter in silence, the sunlight breaking through the windows like a blessing. "You're brave. Don't ever forget that." Her words were simple, but they hit like thunder in my chest. I had spent so many years being told I was fragile, crazy, worthless, that hearing the opposite felt like learning a new language. I didn't believe her right away, but I wrote the words down on a napkin and tucked it into my apron pocket like a shield. Every time I felt myself shrinking again, I touched it, and little by little, something inside me stopped bending. With steady hours and careful planning, I started saving money. Not coins hidden in books this time, but real savings in a real account with my name on it. I opened it myself with shaking hands and a pounding heart, terrified that somehow I'd be denied or worse, recognized. But no one questioned me. No one laughed. I was just another woman trying to build something from the ground up. Every deposit felt like rewriting history, like claiming back the years I'd lost. I still skipped meals sometimes to save more, still reused the same coat through the snow, but I didn't mind, because every dollar I saved was proof. I was never going back. I signed up for a free night course in business and accounting at the local community center. Just a few hours a week, but it made me feel like I was building towards something real. I was terrified at first, convinced I was too old, too slow, too broken to learn anything new. But I sat in the back, took notes with shaky hands, and listened with a hunger I hadn't felt since I was young. Numbers made sense. They didn't lie, they didn't twist your words or question your worth. Slowly, I began to understand things I'd never been allowed to touch. Budgets, invoices, profit margins. Every lesson was a brick in the foundation of the life I was finally creating with my own two hands. One morning, Margaret called me into her office and closed the door. My heart sank, instinctively bracing for bad news, for rejection, for something being taken away. But instead she smiled. "You've been running this place better than I ever did," she said. "How would you feel about managing the cafe?" I stared at her, speechless, 1,000 reasons why I wasn't enough rising in my throat, but she kept going. You show up. You care. You make this place feel safe. I said yes before my brain could catch up. And just like that, the girl who once counted coins in secret now held keys in her hand. The first day I wore the manager's badge, I stood in front of the mirror in my tiny room and looked at myself with new eyes. My posture was different now, taller, steadier. I didn't flinch at sudden sounds or doubt every decision I made. I had walked through fire and come out stronger, not unscarred but unbroken. I no longer avoided my reflection. I met my own gaze and saw a woman who had rebuilt herself from ashes. Dignity wasn't something given. It was reclaimed, and I had taken it back one silent step, one brave choice at a time. It was an ordinary Thursday morning when I saw him. I was behind the counter preparing coffee orders, focused, calm, when the door chimed and there he was. Richard, standing just inside the cafe, looking older, heavier, as if life had finally started pressing down on him the way he had once pressed down on me. My heart stopped, the air thinned, and for a second I thought I might faint. He looked around, clearly not recognizing me at first, but then our eyes met. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I just stood there, frozen, watching him see me, the version of me he never imagined would survive without him. His eyes widened in disbelief, as if I were some ghost returned to haunt him, some impossible version of the woman he'd once crushed under silence. He opened his mouth but no words came out. He just stared, blinking, as if waiting for me to vanish. I saw him scan me up and down, looking for signs of weakness, for the woman who used to tremble when he raised his voice. But she was gone. I didn't smile, didn't greet him, didn't offer him the power of my fear. I simply raised an eyebrow, calm, steady, and turned back to the espresso machine without saying a word. For the first time, he was the one shrinking. You, he said finally, voice low and uncertain, like he was trying to rewrite the story in real time. I wiped down the counter and glanced at him like I would any other customer. You're alive? He asked, almost to himself. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, watching his face twist between confusion and something that looked like regret, but I didn't buy it. He looked smaller somehow, like the years had chewed on him in all the ways I had once feared they'd chew on me. He was no longer a monster, just a man. Just another man who had underestimated the quiet woman he thought would never leave. He sat at a corner table without ordering anything, waiting, like I would drop everything and fall into old patterns. I've changed, he said when I finally walked over, his voice soft, practiced, just like it had been in the early days when apologies still meant something. I need you, he whispered, trying to lock eyes with me like he used to, like he believed that need was love. He talked about loneliness, bad choices, losing everything, and still I felt nothing. Not anger, not hatred, just distance. He wanted to pull me back into the story where he was the center. But that chapter had closed the day I walked out barefoot. I don't need you anymore, I said, clear and steady, without raising my voice or lowering my eyes. He blinked as if the sentence physically struck him, and for once, he had no comeback. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was simply stating the truth, one he had never expected to hear from my mouth, that I had built a life without him, that I had learned to breathe without his approval, that I had become someone he could no longer control, no longer diminish, no longer define. And as the words hung in the air between us, I realized I wasn't afraid of him, not even a little. His smile tightened, and the calm in his voice began to crack as he leaned forward and hissed, I could ruin you if I wanted to. The old threat, sharp and poisonous, delivered in that familiar tone that used to freeze my blood. But it didn't land. Not this time. I looked at him, really looked, at the bitterness in his eyes, the desperation behind his bravado, the loneliness in every word. He hadn't changed. He had just lost his power. The threat that once kept me silent now sounded pitiful. He wasn't dangerous anymore. He was just a man clinging to the last scraps of control he'd ever have. "You have no power over me anymore," I said quietly, and I meant it with every part of my soul. I wasn't trying to fight him. I was simply drawing a line he could no longer cross. I saw the flicker of recognition in his face. The moment he realized the leash had snapped, the chain had rusted away. I stood there, not angry, not triumphant, just free. I had waited so long to feel this grounded, this unshakable in my truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My calm terrified him more than any scream ever could. A few customers nearby had begun to notice the tension, the change in tone, the way he leaned across the table like a threat. One woman stood up and walked over, placing herself between us with fierce simplicity. "Is everything okay here?" she asked. Before I could respond, Margaret came out from the back, eyes locked on Richard like a hawk spotting prey. "You need to leave," she said. He sputtered, tried to protest, but she didn't flinch. "Now." He stood, red-faced and cornered, glancing around at strangers who no longer looked away. He walked out the same way I once did, slowly, with nothing in his hands and no power in his name. A week later, I received a message from that same neighbor who had written me months before, short, direct, and laced with a strange sort of closure. He lost his job. His health's bad. He's all alone. I stared at the words, waiting for some kind of emotion to rise, sorrow, anger, satisfaction, but none of it came. Just a breath. A quiet breath of something that felt like release. I didn't celebrate his fall. I didn't mourn it either. It was simply the natural result of a man who had emptied everyone around him. And now, he was living in the silence he had once forced onto me. He had destroyed every bridge, poisoned every connection, and pushed away every soul that had tried to love him. Now the same loneliness he used as a weapon had turned on him. Not in revenge, but in reflection. The silence he once controlled now surrounded him like a punishment he couldn't escape. No applause. No rescue. Just the echo of his own voice bouncing off the walls he built. And me? I didn't even need to speak his name anymore. The past no longer had chains to wrap around my throat. It had turned into dust, and I had already walked through the storm. With the money I had saved over months of careful planning, I finally signed a lease on a tiny apartment above a flower shop. The walls were thin, the pipes grown, but every corner was mine. I bought second-hand furniture, painted the kitchen yellow, and hung thrifted curtains with trembling hands. For the first time, I chose every detail, from the chipped mugs to the soft rug in the hallway. I cooked my own meals, played music without asking permission, and danced barefoot in the living room just because I could. The apartment wasn't perfect, but it was filled with something I had never known before, joy. And joy, I discovered, is loud in the quietest ways. One morning, brushing my teeth with the window open, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and stopped. The woman staring back wasn't broken or tired or afraid. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes steady, her mouth curved into something unfamiliar but real. A smile. I leaned in closer, searching for remnants of the woman who had once apologized for existing, and found none. I saw strength, earned through pain, and softness preserved despite it. That moment wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, private, sacred. I finally recognized myself, and I was proud of who I saw. Loving myself didn't come all at once. It arrived in small daily choices. Letting myself rest without guilt. Buying a scarf just because I liked the color. Saying no without explaining why. I stopped measuring my worth by what I could do for others and started listening to what I needed. I forgave myself for staying too long, for not knowing better, for surviving the only way I could. I stopped chasing approval like oxygen. I was enough, not because someone told me so, but because I decided it for myself. On the anniversary of the night I left, I returned to that park bench where I had slept my first night alone, holding my bag like a shield. I wore a warm coat this time, and in my hand was a single red flower. Nothing expensive, just real. I sat in silence for a while, watching the same tree sway in the wind, remembering the fear, the numbness, the cold. Then I placed the flower on the bench, not in mourning but in gratitude. That place had witnessed my lowest point, and now it would witness my offering to the version of me who had kept walking. She deserved that honor. We both did. There came a day when I could tell my story without my voice trembling, when the memories no longer tore open fresh wounds. I didn't forget. I didn't minimize. But the pain no longer owned me. I spoke about what happened like someone who had walked through fire and no longer feared the smoke. I didn't need people to understand, I only needed to know I had survived. And in the space where shame used to live, there was now something else. Quiet, steady pride. I had been broken. I had rebuilt. One morning, a letter arrived at the cafe, addressed to me in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't from a court or a friend, it was from him. Richard's lawyer had sent it, but the contents were all his. He said he was sorry, that he regretted everything, that he was a different man now. He wrote that life without me was empty, meaningless, and that he dreamed every night of a second chance. He claimed he'd do anything, therapy, confession, change, just to hear my voice again. I sat with the letter in silence, not angry, not tempted, just stunned that after all this time, he still believed I could be his rescue. I read the letter twice, then once more just to make sure I didn't miss anything, but it was all the same. Words wrapped in guilt and desperation dressed up as love. I didn't cry. I didn't feel revenge. I just smiled, a slow, sad, knowing smile that tasted like irony and freedom. Then I tore the letter into tiny pieces, not in rage but in release. He no longer lived in my present, and my future had no room for shadows. That smile stayed with me all day, tucked inside like armor. It was the clearest sign of all that I was no longer his to reach. Not long after, Margaret called me into her office with eyes that sparkled beneath her usual calm. "I'm retiring," she said, "and I want you to have the cafe." I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, but she slid a folder across the table. "Legal documents, notarized and real. You built this place with me. You saved it more than once. I trust you," she said simply. I didn't know what to say, didn't even know how to breathe. But I signed, my hands shaking, my eyes wet, and suddenly the place that had once saved me now belonged to me. A chapter closed. A legacy passed. A dream born from ashes. Standing behind the counter of my cafe, holding the keys in my hand, I realized I was no longer a supporting character in someone else's life. I was the author now of my hours, my choices, my peace. I made decisions boldly, hired staff who needed second chances, filled the walls with art made by women like me. I wrote the menu in my own handwriting. I planted lavender by the front door. I started every morning not with fear but with purpose. And for the first time since I was a girl, I felt powerful, not because someone gave me permission but because I had finally claimed it. Years later, walking home one night under a pink and golden sky, I saw him again, sitting on the curb outside a liquor store, face sunken, clothes stained, holding out a cup for spare change. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't recognize me. I stood there for a moment, not frozen, not shaken, just observing. The man who once towered over me now sat hunched and hollow. He wasn't a monster anymore, just a cautionary tale. I didn't feel pity or pride, only a deep, quiet peace. As I stood across the street from him, I didn't say a word, didn't make a sound, didn't let a single thought of the past control my breath. I had nothing left to prove, no need to confront or explain or remind him of what he did. My silence was louder than any scream, stronger than any final word. I simply stood there for a moment, feeling the contrast between who I had been and who I had become. The silence that once caged me now protected me. It was my shield, my choice, my declaration of peace. And in that stillness, I felt powerful in a way he would never understand. He looked up for a second, dazed, uncertain, and for a moment our eyes met, not in recognition but in passing. I saw no fire left in him, No cruelty, just a man crushed by the life he built for himself. He blinked, confused, and I realized he didn't know who I was anymore. And that was the final gift. I had outgrown even his memory. I gave him nothing. Not pity, not anger, not acknowledgement. I turned, walked past him like a stranger in the street. And that's exactly what he had become to me. As I walked away, each step felt light, solid, grounded in a life that was mine alone. I didn't look back once. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because there was nothing left behind worth revisiting. The past had already taught me everything it came to teach. My freedom wasn't something I ran to. It was something I had built, breath by breath, decision by decision. I had crossed every bridge, endured every storm, and finally found still water. The version of me who once begged for love now walked in certainty. I had left, and that was my greatest victory. Those $25 I hid in a box of tampons didn't just buy me a bus ticket. They bought me time, safety, dignity, and the chance to reclaim my soul. They were the seeds of a life that no one could take from me again. I used to think freedom had to be loud, dramatic, filled with applause. But mine came in quiet mornings, honest work, and the ability to sleep without fear. It came in laughter that didn't ask permission and mirrors that told the truth. I saved myself. And every cent, every step, every silent act of courage led me here. To a life that belongs only to me.